Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing very well, thank you very much. And we've got a lovely story tonight. We've got a story where 3 boys have gone to stay with their grandparents in Toronto. And one of the boys, who's the elder boy, is called Keegan. And he is fascinated about anything to do with the paranormal, fascinated with ghosts and things. And they're sitting around the dinner table, and he asks his parents, what his grandparents, what they think about ghosts. And the grandfather is saying, I'm open to those kind of things. And then he's saying that he has a story that he can share with the boys. But he doesn't want to share that story because both the grandparents have agreed to take the story down to the grave. But now the grandmother, her name's Emma, is persuading her husband William, please tell the children, our grandchildren, this story. And so that is exactly what's happening here. We're learning about their fascination for bird watching, and obviously something very curious happened to them all those years ago when they were teenagers. So before we continue with the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with part 2 of our story tonight. My grandmother paused for a moment and then said, "Well, I do remember Paul Mitchin telling us magpies that his pedantic, overbearing wife Esmeralda didn't understand why he spent so much time with us bird-watching. She failed, of course, to appreciate his true love for birds. She ridiculed him incessantly about his passion, almost as if his interest in birds was juvenile, stupid, and not manly enough. The woman was insufferable, he told us. She's always on at me about this and about that. She treats me like I'm a child. Sometimes when Esmeralda is very mad at me, if she's ranting over something because I've said something that's clearly offended her, I'll discover she's locked me up in the bedroom or the study and won't let me out for several hours until I've apologized to her for whatever it is that I've clearly done. Sometimes I don't even know what to apologize for, as I don't know what made her mad in the first place, as everything I do seems to rattle her cage these days and rub her up the wrong way. Sometimes it is the most trivial, unlikely things that will set my wife off, like if I come home from the store, for example, with the wrong brand of tuna fish. She'll then throw a tantrum and rant about it, tossing out all the tuna furiously that I purchased in the dumpster, claiming it's so substandard that even our cat wouldn't dream of eating it. I think some people in the Magpies believed that Paul Mitchin's wife's objectionable treatment of him was highly exaggerated, almost as if Paul himself was looking for sympathy from us. Many in the group thought this way, until Paul Mitchin's friend, Mr. Robin Cartwright, who was a member of the Magpies, was invited to dinner at the Mitchins' house. Robin Cartwright got the shock of his life, let me tell you, when he joined the Mitchins one night for dinner. Let's just say he was utterly appalled at the disrespectful way Paul's wife Esmeralda treated him. Robin told us Magpies in extreme confidence that he had a new sense of respect for Paul Mitchin, for he had never seen a man put up with so much abuse at the hands of his own wife, the woman who's supposed to love him and have his back. Robin went on to tell us that Esmeralda had about as much charm as a duck-billed platypus, and was so demasculating and verbally condescending towards Paul. It was over dinner that Mr. Cartwright witnessed Esmeralda's treatment of Paul first-hand, almost as if he was a fly on the wall, observing everything. And let's just say he might as well have been, for there was no interaction between Paul and his wife. He claimed the energy around the dinner table that evening was tight and tense, like a starched napkin. Esmeralda told Paul she was delighted he'd joined them for dinner, and it was a pleasure to finally meet him. But the 3 of them ate their dinner in absolute silence. There was no conversation whatsoever. It was like you were eating a school dinner, with the head teacher observing your manners. And Esmeralda's beady dark eyes were fixed on Paul for the entire meal. Robin said he'd never felt so uncomfortable, seated around a dinner table, as all you could hear was the clatter of cutlery and the tinkle of glasses, and beyond that, Everything was completely mute. Finally, the cat walked into the room and began to meow incessantly. Robin said that helped relieve some of the stress around the table, as Esmeralda excused herself and got up to attend to the cat's rather demanding needs, returning to the table, apologizing profusely for the rude interruption on the cat's part. At one point, Esmeralda leant over the table to wipe Paul's moustache, claiming he had breadcrumbs on his moustache, which Robin said was not remotely true. It was like she was looking for any opportunity to scold her husband, as if in some really bizarre way it brought her a great deal of satisfaction, bringing him to heel, rather like a badly behaved dog. "Look at yourself, love. Oh, you're such an embarrassment, aren't you?" she said. "We've got a guest, so you should mind your manners, Paul. If only you learned to eat a little bit more respectfully. I'm sure Mr. Cartwright over here doesn't want to see everything going on in your mouth, do you, Mr. Cartwright?" she said, her steely eyes fixed on poor Robin. "You mustn't mind my husband's appalling manners, Mr. Cartwright. I'm sorry that you have to witness them first-hand. I'm afraid Paul never seems to learn how to eat with his mouth fully closed. Believe me, I've tried to teach him to mind his manners, but he never appears to be able to learn." Robin Cartwright was determined to stick up for Paul. He turned around to Esmeralda and abruptly said, "I think Paul has meticulous manners, and I didn't notice any crumbs on his moustache either." Esmeralda Mitchin just laughed. "You're very generous to say that, Mr. Cartwright, very generous indeed. Of course you would say that about your good friend, because you're an incredibly kind man, and I do appreciate your generosity, really I do. For the record, you have no idea what I have to put up with this husband of mine. He can be so dreadfully sloppy at the very best of times, and he has absolutely no clue how to dress. And I can see, Mr. Cartwright, based on what you are wearing tonight, that you are a very well put-together man. When it comes to my Paul, I'm afraid, I always have to instruct him on what to wear. If he had his way, he'd leave our house looking more than a little dishevelled, let me tell you. His tie would probably be put on incorrectly. His shoes would be scuffed, so I have to give them a jolly good old polish. I always tell him the importance of presenting himself well to the world, but I'm afraid with Paul it falls on deaf ears. He has no real interest in impressing people, you see, Mr. Cartwright. He'd happily wear the same old clothes day after day if given the chance, without even bothering to change them, and I'm not joking either. Good job he's got me to nip him into shape, or God knows what he'd look like. I buy all Paul's clothes myself. The man just wouldn't know how to put anything together. So if you appreciate how well dressed my husband is, well, I have to tell you, Mr. Cartwright, it's all down to me. Not that I wish to gloat, of course. Well, I've never known Paul to be anything less than well presented, Robin said. But even if he were to wear the same casual clothes every day, would it really be such a train smash? I don't think so. At this, Esmeralda burst out laughing. She waved a finger at Robin and said, "You're a naughty man, Mr. Cartwright. I like you, very much as it happens. You've got a very good sense of humour, and I appreciate that. But I wasn't joking, Mrs. Mitchin," Robin said. "Oh, call me Esmeralda, Mr. Cartwright," said Esmeralda, her eyes twinkling with mischief. She didn't think for a single second that Robin was being remotely serious. In a moment of privacy, when Mrs. Mitchin excused herself from the table and scurried away to get the dessert ready, which was, I believe, a pavlova covered with fresh fruit and plenty of whipped cream, Robin Cartwright turned around to Paul and said, "My God, your wife is something else, isn't she? I don't mean that as a compliment, Paul. Why the hell don't you just get a divorce and be done with it? Then you won't have to put up with her henpecking and nagging all the time. Esmeralda can't see any good in you, can she? She talks about you as if you're an insubordinate child, that has misbehaved badly in school and is about to be issued with a detention. I'm telling you, Paul, you deserve a whole lot better than to be treated with such disdain and disrespect. By your own wife, for goodness sake. I've never seen anything so despicable before. And the worst part of it all, Esmeralda doesn't even realise what she's doing to you, how badly she's treating you. I must apologise to you, Paul, in person. I never realised for a second things were this bad for you. Some people in the Magpies thought you were exaggerating about the state of your marriage, looking for sympathy and attention when you aired your grievances to us. But on the contrary, you minimised how bad things really were between the two of you. If the truth be told, Paul, I've never met a woman as obnoxious as your wife, and I don't say that lightly. She's a very unkind, ruthless woman. You're a saint to put up with the likes of her. Paul responded with a heavy heart, and said very matter-of-factly to Robin, You think what you witnessed around the dinner table tonight is bad, do you? You haven't seen the half of it. You have no idea what that woman is really like, but I will spare you those details. I grumble about her incessantly to the Magpies, to vent and let off a little steam. I don't tell everyone just how bad she can get, for fear, probably, that they wouldn't believe me. Esmeralda is on her best behaviour tonight, as you are our guest, but I won't tell you what goes on behind closed doors, unless I want to humiliate myself for admitting I put up with all this. I'm ashamed of myself for being so pathetically subservient towards her. I think I'm more like a mouse than a man these days, for I seem unable to stand up to her. But believe me, I've tried over the years. But it's no good. She seems to always end up getting the last laugh. I feel intimidated by my own wife, and every evening after work I dread returning home to her. My boss at the office, Mr. Ramsay, thinks I'm such a diligent hard worker, because I'm the first to arrive and the last to leave the offices on a working day. He falsely believes I'm devoted to my job, and is always giving me promotions as a consequence because of my devotion to my work. But he doesn't know that it's not an unbridled ambition that is driving me to work every day, to work these insane hours of mine. It's simply because I can be away from Esmeralda for as long as I possibly can. Was she always like this, Paul? If you don't mind my asking. Robin Cartwright asked Mr. Mitchin outright. You see, Robin was privately wondering how such a decent, lovely man like Paul Mitchin had ended up marrying the snake in the Garden of Eden, so to speak. I mean, how did you meet her? He asked rather lamely. Paul Mitchin dabbed a napkin over his moustache to wipe away some invisible breadcrumbs, and then he said, Well, let's see, shall we? Where did I meet Esmeralda? That's a very good question. I was about 29 years old at the time, unmarried, so ostensibly my mother was getting ants in her pants about my unmarried status. I had not met a girl to settle down with, and in my mother's opinion, that was the end of the world. I think she thought I would remain a bachelor for the rest of my life, and she didn't want that for me. I think a large part of her desire for me to get married was self-serving, of course, because she wanted to have grandchildren. But alas for my mother, her dreams to become a grandmother were never realized. I made certain of that. I never wanted to make Esmeralda pregnant. Can you imagine the two of us having children? Those poor kids. I wouldn't want them to have to put up with the likes of Esmeralda as a mother. I know exactly what you mean, Paul, Robin admitted. I think your wife would be a tyrant for a mother. Anyway, continued Paul, my mother told me if I didn't commit to someone soon, by the time I wanted to settle down and have a family, there'd be no good woman left. My mother could be alarmist like that. I didn't care that I hadn't met anyone. It wasn't actually a big deal for me at the time. I enjoyed being single to a certain extent, but I never told my mother this, of course. My mother was expressing her extreme disappointment to friends about my unmarried status. She was asking around if anyone knew of a nice girl who might be a suitable companion for me, that I could eventually marry one day. My mother was asking everyone who would listen, as if I was a hopeless cause. She didn't even discriminate who she asked. That's how desperate she was for me to get married and to find a wife. She asked the postman, the butcher, the baker, the grocer, you name it, if they knew of anyone who would have me, as if she was advertising for a stray dog that was looking for a loving home, someone who would be willing to adopt it. It was very embarrassing, to say the very least, but my mother's pursuit for a romantic partner for me was relentless in every sense of the word. By all accounts, I'm afraid to say, my mother has always been the kind of woman that is very driven. She gets exactly what she wants. When she decides to go for something, she does so with all guns blazing, let me tell you. The manager's wife of our grocery store in town said she knew of this lovely, incredibly pretty, demure, young 28-year-old lady who was unmarried. Her name was Esmeralda, and she suggested that she set us up on a blind date. My mother was overjoyed. She planned the whole thing and had very high expectations. As you can imagine, she told me not to blow things between me and Esmeralda. She wanted me to be the perfect gentleman towards this woman, and to make sure I showed her a very good time. So I took Esmeralda out on our very first date. I remember my mother saying to me very sternly, "Don't let her slip through your hands, love. Please don't. This one's a keeper, let me tell you. And if you let her go, I promise you, you will live to regret it. Believe me, I know. Women like her, well, they don't grow on trees." When I saw Esmeralda for the very first time, I was struck by how beautiful she was. In truth, I don't think I'd ever seen a more beautiful woman in my life. So my heart was wildly aflutter, dangerously so, you could say. I looked upon her adoringly, not really getting to know her first, which on my part was a catastrophic, very foolish mistake. I guess I thought her personality would match her outside veneer, like a woman's shoes match her handbag. Even my male friends were encouraging me to tie the knot with her. They believed I'd struck gold, and for a short while I thought I had done so too, until I realized the gold I'd pulled in was fool's gold, and not the real thing. I had not got to know Esmeralda at the time, because she seemed quiet, shy, and somewhat self-effacing, rather like a rosebud that has not yet opened, so you aren't aware of its full glory. I thought she was very sweet. My mother, of course, persuaded me to propose to Esmeralda on our second date. She was terrified that the relationship between the two of us would go up in plumes of smoke. Let's just say it would certainly have done so if I'd got to know her a little better. I didn't realize at that point in time that there was an insidiously dark side to my wife, that she kept well hidden from the world, and the cat only came out of the bag, I'm afraid, after I got married to her, and then I found out that she really could scratch. Robin Cartwright raised a brow. "Don't tell me you listened to your mother, Paul. Surely you realized rushing into marriage was a very bad idea. Surely you weren't that naive. I mean, you didn't even know Esmeralda at the time. If she really was such a catch, why had she not been snapped up a long time ago by a handsome man? Granted, she may have been beautiful, but everybody knows beauty is not enough to sustain a marriage long term. There has to be a deeper connection between two people when they make a commitment to each other, so that they can weather the storms of life together. If the person has a personality you cannot abide, even the beauty you first thought you appreciated will slip away and dissolve, almost as if it never existed. I've seen that happen before." Paul shrugged his shoulders with a resigned acceptance of defeat, like someone admitting they've already lost the war. I know. You don't have to tell me something I already know. I was a complete idiot, wasn't I? The only thing I can say in my defence is I had no real experience with women. I'd been to an all-boys school, you see, my entire life. I never had any girlfriends. or any experience with the fairer sex. When it came to dating in the early days, I was a blubbering idiot, and the woman I dated never accepted a second date with me, and I can hardly blame them for that. When Esmeralda came along, I guess I really found her beauty so alluring. So I decided to take my mother's seasoned advice. I popped the question to her, but never for a single second did I believe she'd actually say yes. But I guess I thought I had nothing to lose. I genuinely thought I had fallen head over heels in love with her. I found her so pleasing on the eye. But as you say, that is not enough. And that certainly came back to haunt me in a brutal way, you could say. Don't tell me after 2 weeks of dating Esmeralda she accepted your proposal, asked Robin, looking quite taken aback by this. It sounds like she was very eager to get married. Rather too eager, if you ask me. And that's a red flag. I knew my wife, I'll have you know, for 2 years before I married her. Not that I'm trying to make you feel bad about that. Of course, I've heard of people much like yourself who got married after one meeting, and years later they're still happy. So I guess you can say when it comes to us men, one cap does not fit us all. And I guess those men who married someone in haste and ended up extremely happy were the lucky ones who played a game of Russian roulette with their lives and ended up winning the lottery. Well, I was an idiot, wasn't I? Poor Mitchin admitted. A big idiot. I should have stood up to my mother's pressure. Even my father told me as much. He told me very firmly not to marry Esmeralda. He did? Asked Paul Cartwright, his eyes widening in surprise at this frank revelation. Yes, he did. He very discreetly took me to one side, I'll have you know, when my mother's back was turned. For let's just say if my mother knew he was discouraging me not to marry Esmeralda, she'd have had his guts for garters. What did your father say? Asked Robin, raising a brow. Well, he told me that Esmeralda was indeed very beautiful. He could understand why my mother was so enchanted by her, and why I was attracted to the woman, enamoured and seemingly bowled over by her. A woman I barely knew. He said to me that I needed more time to get to know Esmeralda, because she might not be as sweet as she first appeared. He told me some women looked sweet on the outside, but were as bitter as gall on the inside. Your father actually said that to you? Asked Robin, looking incredibly impressed. Do you think he might have had an inkling that something was seriously off about Esmeralda? I think so, Paul admitted. I think my father was an astute man, you see. He picked up things about people quickly, read their body language very easily. He was much more perceptive than my mother was. I remember once my mother had a couple over to dinner, you know. My dad said the couple hated each other's guts. My mother told him he was talking absolute nonsense, but a month later that couple got divorced. It turned out they really did despise each other. So your father was astute. Why didn't you listen to his salient advice? Asked Robin, getting more and more drawn into Paul's rather extraordinary love story. Well, if you can call it that. A perfect mismatch might have been a better description. Because I'm an idiot, that's why. And undoubtedly, my mother's persuasiveness was eating me up. She was going on in her usual way about how I would never meet anyone like Esmeralda again, and how I would be an absolute fool not to snap her up at once. I guess I believed her. More fool me. Growing up, my mother was a pretty poor judge of character, so why I listened to her, God only knows. I should have paid closer attention to my father's salient words, for I wouldn't be in the sticky mess now, would I? Rather like a bee that's swimming around in the jam and can't fly away. That's me. The sorry story of my life. So did Esmeralda accept your marriage proposal after 2 weeks of dating? Asked Robin. I've got a funny feeling you're going to say yes. I very much doubt, My wife would have said yes to a proposal of marriage on our second date. I think I'd have come off as being desperately insecure. I mean, rushing into marriage is insane, any way you look at it. Well, you want to know the answer to the question? Esmeralda said yes right away. On the contrary, she didn't even hesitate. I remember thinking she could do so much better than me. She could have men with lots of money, because beautiful women like her can pretty much snap their fingers and have their pick of the crop. Esmeralda was so lovely, but she happily accepted my proposal without a moment's hesitation. I learnt later that over the years, Esmeralda had dated a significant amount of men, but the relationships had always gone pear-shaped when the men realized what she was really like. So those men were a hell of a lot more astute than I obviously was. Maybe thanks to so many rejections by men in the past, Esmeralda quickly accepted my proposal of marriage. So I was the one that didn't get away, you could say. I remember Esmeralda's parents were both estranged. That should have been another red flag to me. Her mother did not speak to her father anymore. There was no love lost between the two of them. They hated each other's guts, but both were in attendance at the wedding, sitting on opposite ends of the aisle, not even daring to look at each other. The hatred between them was quite palpable. Esmeralda's father came up to me at one point, before the ceremony. He whispered in my ear, "Don't do it, son. My daughter is just like my ex-wife. They are two birds of a feather, rotten to the core, as poisonous as an apple seed. Do yourself a favour. Don't go through with this wedding. You will live to regret it, for the rest of your life, I'm sure. Esmeralda is not what she first appears or what she seems. She's pretending to be sweetness and light. That's a ruse, to draw you in, you see. That's what her mother did to me, and that's what she's doing to you. The best thing I ever did was parting ways with that obnoxious mother of hers, who makes the snake's vipers seem benign. And I hate to tell you this, but my daughter is not far behind." "He said that to you?" asked Robin, sounding somewhat aghast. "Didn't you ask what the hell he meant? Let me tell you, if my wife's father had come up to me before our wedding ceremony and said stuff like that to me, it would have given me pause for thought, let me tell you. No, I'm afraid I didn't take much notice of what he was saying. I thought the man was embittered, like couples so often are after a stinky divorce. So I naively, very ignorantly paid his advice no heed, and went through with the wedding. You know when you're young you think you know it all, don't you? You arrogantly, ignorantly assume you figured it all out, and one day you realize the cold, hard truth. You realize how naively dumb and inexperienced you actually were, and how little you actually knew. Even though I'm significantly older now than I was back then, I never assumed to know it all. I realize I'm always learning, and that even now I don't know nearly enough about anything." "So when did things fall apart between you and Esmeralda?" Robin asked. "How soon after you got married?" "Within 2 weeks of marriage. I was finding my beautiful wife insufferable, and wondering what the hell I'd got myself into. For the sweet, demure young woman I thought I married became a complete bully. It was funny when she treated me with such a patronizing, condescending manner. I'd look at her and wonder how I ever could have believed she was beautiful, for she had become like an ice queen, hard, cold, and toffee-nosed in every regard. 3 weeks into our marriage, I was no longer attracted to my wife. Her flawless beauty became defiled and polluted by her ugly personality. Of course, I confided in my mother because we were very close about my feelings. I told her I wanted out of my marriage, and she told me in no uncertain terms that I had made a vow before God, and I could not backtrack on those promises. Of course, she felt desperately sorry for my plight when she realized I'd married a complete dud. But what could she do about it? It was too late to cry over spilt milk. I went to see my pastor on her advice. and he said much the same to me. He told me that I had to make the most of a very bad situation. I had made my resolute promises of faithfulness before God, to honour my wife in both sickness and health, until death us do part. I needed to keep those promises. Esmeralda's mother was as bad as Esmeralda, let me tell you. And when she was alive, she was viciously always putting me down, attacking my character, as furiously and as contemptuously as Esmeralda clearly did. I think she hated all men. So I'm not surprised, quite frankly, that her ex-husband left her and demanded a divorce. I guess I haven't had the courage to do the same. Esmeralda's got quite the ego on her, you see. She's always had a superior attitude, believing that she's better than anybody else. I think she'd come after me with a pitchfork if I dared end our marriage, because she couldn't stand the humiliation of being rejected and all her friends knowing about it. Esmeralda likes to call the shots. By all accounts, image and reputation are everything to her. But I've wanted out of this marriage for years. But if I left her, let's just say, hell hath no fury than a woman scorned. Quite frankly, I haven't got the guts, nor do I have the stamina, to get out of this rather prickly, grisly situation, you could say. I still, beyond all that, take my marriage vows reasonably seriously. Although, if the truth be told, I have never loved Esmeralda, nor do I like her very much. Indeed, I'm living with someone I actually despise. Well, I can't say I'm surprised by that, said Robin. Don't put yourself down. You're a man, not a mouse, Paul. If you want to know the God's honest truth, I am intimidated by your wife myself, and I'm not even married to her. So God knows what you go through every day. I don't think I could be married to your wife for a single minute, and yet you've put up with her for over 50 years. That makes you a saint in my book. I don't for the life of me know how you've done it, man, but I'm impressed. Poor man, said Keegan, interrupting my grandmother. The woman sounds like a crocodile, but Paul's story has taught me one thing, and that's not to be fooled by a pretty face. Esmeralda was a crocodile, all right, agreed my grandmother. Needless to say, Paul Mitchin was a religious man who took his marriage vows seriously. So a divorce, especially after the pastor's stern advice, was something that he never wanted to go through with. It wasn't on the cards for him, I suspect. He confessed to being desperately unhappy in his relationship with Esmeralda. Isn't that right, William, love? Absolutely. Everything you've said, love, is spot on, said my grandfather. I'm glad you've told our grandchildren the background story of Paul Mitchin's life, for it's relevant to this story. And I think that Paul Mitchin was putting up with a great deal of abuse from Esmeralda. I don't think we knew the half of it. I guess he suffered in silence, like so many men do. I know he claimed that she locked him up in his bedroom and study from time to time, if she was mad at him. They did sleep in separate bedrooms, as Esmeralda couldn't put up with his snoring. She said Paul sounded like a pot-belly pig. If the truth be told, I think a lot more was going on in the Mitchin household than Paul ever admitted to. Stuff he didn't want to share. What do you mean by that? Keegan asked. I mean, said my grandfather, that I think from time to time Paul Mitchin was physically abused by his wife, more than he ever let us know about, because it was humiliating for him. But at a later stage he did confess to us that the abuse he had been subjected to had indeed also been physical of nature. Keegan pulled a face. You know what, Grandpa? I think men have pride. The last thing they want to do is to admit that the wife is beating up on them. That can be super humiliating for them, don't you think? And more often than not, nobody believes the abuse is taking place, because nobody wants to believe a woman would physically attack her own husband. But I believe it happens. Very well put, Keegan, said my grandfather. Anyway, now that I've told you about Paul Mitchin's marriage, which I believe is a significant part of this story, I'll go back to the day when me and your grandmother were in a bird hide together, with the rest of the magpies, waiting to see if any interesting bird life would come into our focus. So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.